Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Contemporary Art Museum to a conversation about Neighbors, our current exhibition that is both virtual and physically in the museum. Neighbors Slideshows for America, curated by Christian Viveros-Faune. Tonight, we welcome Lisa Sutcliffe, the curator from the Herzfeld the Herzfeld Curator of Photography and Media Arts at the Milwaukee Art Museum. And Lisa has collaborated with Christian in the development of the exhibition and written an essay. The exhibition is 5 artists were commissioned, and Christian is going to share more information about these artists, but each was given a honorarium provided by the Andy Warhol Foundation to develop a new body of work. Each are photographing underexposed communities. We also had funding from Stanton Store, Embrace the Arts Foundation, and the Florida Department of State. We have a good team working together today from the Contemporary Art Museum. Don Fuller is helping with the media aspect of this and the showing of the material. Ashley Jablonski standing by in case we have some technical difficulties. I want to also acknowledge Tony Palms, who figured out how to get old-fashioned slide projectors for this exhibition that project the slides or the images created by the artists. David Waterman is going to provide synthesizing questions or summing up questions which you may submit during the course of the presentation. So if you're on Facebook, submit your questions there, or if you're on Zoom, go to the Q&A button and send your questions in as you think of them. And at about a little before 7 o'clock, around that point in time, we will turn to questions, and David Waterman will filter those and present to Christian Viveros-Faune and Lisa Sutcliffe. Let me go on and just introduce Lisa a little bit further. Before she came to the Milwaukee Art Museum, she served as Assistant Curator of Photography at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and the Co-Curatorial Fellow at the De Cordova Sculpture Park and Museum. She's curated several exhibitions, including James Benning and Sharon Lockhart over time, a project with an artist named Sarah Swernar, and titled Image Model Muse from 2019. She's done a show called the San Quentin Project with Nigel Poor and the Men of the San Quentin State Prison, and she did that in 2018. Penelope Embruco, Future Perfect in 2016, and a project also in 2016 with Reneke Dijkstra titled Rehearsals. She's about to open at the end of November an exhibition with Susan Mizels, Through a Woman's Lens is the title of it, and she will open it first virtually, although it's actually installed in the Milwaukee Art Museum now. So Christian Viveros-Faune is working as our curator-at-large. We're so thrilled that he's with us. He's done several exhibitions, including another that's up at the moment, Life During Wartime, Art in the Age of the Coronavirus. So you might check that out as well. And Christian is living in New York, but comes to Tampa when he can, when travel is not restricted. And we look forward to continuing to work with him as he advises us on artists for our Atelier graphic studio, as well as thinks up brilliant ideas for exhibitions. So with that, Christian, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you. Thank you for the kind words. Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the third event organized around our fall exhibition, The Neighbors Slideshows for America. As you already know, this conversation is unlike many of the events held previously at USFCAM. It is, as you can plainly see, a virtual event, which is entirely apropos since the exhibition is presented at this point mostly virtually. Despite the exhibition being physically installed inside the museum, Museum galleries are temporarily closed to the general public in order to promote best practices with regard to public health and compliance with the University of South Florida closures. That said, as Margaret mentioned, we're presently allowing entry into the galleries to students and members of the university community by prior appointment, so do take advantage of that possibility. You will be richly rewarded if you do. Obviously, when we originally conceived this show, no one envisioned where we're going to be today, not as a planet, not as a country, and certainly not as a museum. We didn't know, we couldn't really imagine that we would be significantly limited in our ability to walk around objects in public or share common space with other art-loving folks. Currently, 8 months into our ongoing lockdowns, society at large correctly demands that we adequately curtail our ability to attend mass gatherings and cultural events. This goes for cities like Tampa and Miami and Milwaukee, where Lisa is, and New York City, where I'm talking to you from, as well as other cities across the US and around the world. In spite of these frankly insane circumstances, and in no small measure because of them, USFCAM made the decision to push on with this and other exhibitions we plan well into next year and beyond. In the case of the neighbors, we chose to double down on our effort to bring you an important exhibition of photographic works by 5 US-based camera artists. What we've done for this specific show, as you'll see in a minute, is to cover our bases. We physically install the exhibition inside our galleries while making sure to bring you, our virtual audience, a digital capture both of the installation and the discrete works that comprise it. Why have we done this? Well, simply because in the words of Winston Churchill, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Especially we think when we're working at what we believe is the leading edge of culture. By installing the work of these 5 artists in the museum's galleries and developing a robust online presence for the show, we'd like to also think that we're getting a jump on what will be going forward, a hybrid model for museum exhibitions. Lisa and Margaret and I were just talking about this in the virtual green room before we came on to talk to you. This model will rely on both a traditional physical installation and a strong online presence as parallel and mutually complementary efforts. Around the country and around the world, leading arts institutions have had to learn the lessons of virtual exhibition making pretty quickly. The first lesson in that lesson plan is that virtual programming, while not a replacement for live and in-person encounters, is also substantially real. More so in the absence of actual physical meetings in real space. Or put differently, what museums have recognized recently is what other cultural entities like, for example, social media or gaming companies have known for a long time now. And that is namely that digital representations cast their own spells and create their own magic and their own opportunities, right? Before I move into talking about the work of the 5 artists that make up the neighbors, I also want to point to a 6th and very important contribution that's to the show that's also available on the homepage of the show. You can find that at ria.usf.edu. And I'm talking here about the terrific essay written by tonight's guest, Lisa Sutcliffe, again, Herzfeld Curator of Photography and Media Arts at the Milwaukee Art Museum. Lisa not only contributed this absolutely fantastic text, he also really generously talked me through a rough sketch of the show and introduced me to the work of several of the artists in question. Her help and advice was, really so invaluable. We've asked her to come here tonight to walk us through some ideas related to the show, but also to talk about her own curatorial practice. And specifically, sort of at the end of our conversation about her upcoming show, which will open in some fashion due to COVID restrictions at the Milwaukee Art Museum. And that show is Susan May Salas Through a Woman's Lens. if the initial idea for the neighbors could have once been considered timely, because it was originally scheduled for January 2021, it was originally intended to be basically a post-mortem on the US presidential elections, then holding it in the middle of these elections might seem, risky, foolish. Be that as it may, when we proposed the idea of moving the exhibition up in the calendar to the artists participating, they really immediately, all of them responded very positively about the idea, which obviously we were all tremendously happy about. But it made me think that they clearly have great faith in images to make that decision, certainly in their images. Because as displayed or rather as projected onto the museum's walls, they're carefully constructed and sequenced images speak to not just the difficult times that we're living through, but also to two really sort of fundamental questions, actually more than two, but these two I do think are absolutely fundamental for the moment. What does America look like is one, and the other is who is and is not an American. Which brings me finally to talk a little about the show itself, right? What it's made of, what it looks like. The idea behind the neighbors is relatively simple. USFCAM commissioned, as Margaret mentioned, 5 brilliant but very, very different camera artists from around the US. They are Woodland Cadet, Guy Greenberg, Curran Hadelberg, Katia Maria Landeros, and Zora J. Murph. We commissioned them to make slideshows, not just to show their pictures, to make slideshows of groups of Americans who they believe are routinely underexposed. Folks whose bodies and faces go unseen so that they are often uncounted, as in the census, or undercounted, right? And possibly even underserved by society at large. Rather than focus on the images of groups of outliers per se, what the exhibition brief asked for were images of Americans of every stripe, with a special focus on those who again appear underrepresented by this country's dominant narratives. That in brief explains the title of the exhibition, but what about the subtitle, right? Slideshows for America. Why slideshows? Well, part of the answer clearly has to do with wanting to do a stripped down show that gets to the essence of photography, which we can define as the practice and sometimes the art of creating durable images by recording light. This at a time when the facts are purportedly communicated by photographs and videos are under fire. Another partial answer is that we wanted to harken back to an earlier age of old time slide projectors and slide carousels, which is again what we're using for the show, old time analog projectors. We wanted to do this to evoke the immediacy of family and community slideshows of another age. In an important way, this show is stripped down to the max. It's conceived in the spirit of Mies van der Rohe's minimalist dictum, less is more. The Neighbors is made up of two basic elements: images distilled into light projections, and the sounds the projectors make as they move through the stories these 5 artists tell in their studied sequences of images. These distinct stories, as we've mentioned, are meant to defy narratives that describe entire swathes of the country as monoliths or blocks. Each slideshow contains images that suggest that parts of the country are broken. Others highlight the stubborn human values of the communities they portray: perseverance, patience, bravery, quiet resistance, even joy. By way of closing, and before giving you a peek at a video of the installation inside the galleries, I want to read a paragraph from the essay Lisa wrote for the exhibition. I want to do it because I think it summarizes the spirit of the show particularly well. And here I'm quoting Lisa. For the Neighbors, she writes, USFCAM invited a group of US-based photographers to offer an interpretation of our moment, of the Americans who might otherwise go unseen. The exhibition's title suggests a gathering of familiar people, but who are hazily defined. Together, they make a community, a society, a country. These photographs provide sketches, diaries, and snapshots, offering fresh perspectives and providing a richer and more complex depiction of American life. Observing is an important form of listening, of understanding. These sequences of images are an invitation to recognize and appreciate the ways in which a diverse set of hearts and minds have reacted to and reflected upon our community, pardon me, our common society at this unusual time. Don, maybe we can go ahead and cue the installation video. Right, so I want to show you what the installation actually looks like. Bear with us, it'll be about 2 minutes and 40 seconds or so. While we do it, I want you to consider, if not this time, then the next time, this exercise. As you watch, maybe blow up the screen as big as you can. Turn out the light, turn out in whatever room you're in, whether it's your living room or your kitchen or your bedroom, whatever it is, turn the sound way up and concentrate. And I want you to think, as you're looking at these pictures, of Lisa's, frankly, magical sentence. Observing is an important form of listening, of understanding. Now imagine you're sitting alongside other folks watching images of this extended family, a very extended family. Those might be your parents, or your sisters, and your brothers, or your uncles, or your aunts, or your cousins, or your neighbors. I think they deserve, if not your affection, then at least your compassion, your comprehension, and respect, especially now, maybe more than ever now. It looks like a good place to stop, Don. Lisa, you want to turn on your camera and mic? Hiya.
Kristen,
Welcome.
thank you so much for having me. And that show looks just beautiful. I'm sorry we can't sit in the space and talk about it there.
I took the words right out of my mouth. Much rather be there for all the reasons in the world, aside from being able to actually see you and talk to you in person. And the green room, we mentioned the green room, which clearly we don't have. Anyway, listen, before we've done something quite smart, and I cheated a bit. We decided that we would have you select a number of images, 2 each for each of the 5 artists, and then I would chuck in my 10. But I cheated because I decided not to do that. I wanted to concentrate on the ones you picked. So, but before we get to that, before we get to doing that, I wanted to ask you like some general questions about, I don't know, the role of photography during this political season, and really what I sort of want to ask you about it, and this is the sense I have, but I think you're the pro in this field, is, do you think there's been an uptick of documentary-like work in the last, I don't know, decade, half decade? Why do I have that sense? Maybe
I think there's always been documentary work. I think it may be that we're paying more attention to it now. And I think the form it takes may be more immediate. So it could be that. I was just thinking, even as we were watching, your video of the slideshows, that I think in part too, that we're just so used to seeing so many images online, and so many of them describe an America that feels very different from the pictures that these artists have made. I keep thinking, especially even of this election season, of these kind of apocalyptic photographs of people in face shields screaming at people wearing no mask, and the opposite, and people with AR-15s taking over government buildings. And, you kind of feel like you're watching a zombie movie when you look at the news. And so there's this relaxation and almost a kind of recognition in seeing some of these pictures, where you can be reminded that we are all Americans, and every American has a family and has a neighborhood, and they might live right next door to you. And those people are still all here. We're just not seeing pictures of them every day. And so I think there's something very comforting in looking at these pictures, even though they're pictures of the periphery and of these kind of in-between moments. And I think that maybe the word documentary often gets ascribed to those more political pictures, and
Right.
not to the pictures we're looking at here. And in fact, I think these pictures are a more important form of documentary, and those have always sort of been a part of the photographic practice.
Right. Well, listen, I'm sure you're right that it's work that maybe is now sort of, maybe now it just seems more urgent, more important to be looking at images that have always been there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we're more attuned to their messages. I mean, you've long worked with these kinds of images, not necessarily the images in the artists in the neighbors, but with documentary style images. I mean, I think some of the shows that that Margaret mentioned are in that vein. Others are not. But I mentioned this because I wanted you to talk a little about something called the Milwaukee model that you organized with a counterpart at the Haggerty. 2018, was it?
Mm-hmm.
And then I was lucky to be able to attend. But the subtitle of this particular project that you put together, the Milwaukee model, was envisioning the role of the arts in criminal justice reform. Can you explain further what that was?
Yeah, so I organized an exhibition with Nigel Poor on a project she'd been working on inside of with pictures that she, an archive of photographs that she had been given access to from San Quentin State Prison that were made between the 30s and the 80s, but also a collaborative project she'd been working on with the guys inside for almost a decade. And so we organized an exhibition, and I'm really interested in how museums and art can act as a catalyst for conversation. And in particular in Milwaukee, where we have the worst rate of incarceration of Black men in the country, I thought it would be interesting to use this exhibition as a platform for conversations within our own community about the role of the arts in criminal justice reform. And so Amelia Layden, who is a curator at the Haggerty Museum, and brought us an exhibition of the work of Sable Elise Smith, who's also making work about this subject. And so the two of us collaborated on a 3-day symposium that would bring people to speak, including you, Christian, about the sort of the state of the field, as you might say, and then also some national models for diversion programs, prison education programs, and sort of other forms that Milwaukee and other cities like it might look to consider the role that photography, that art can play, and even sort of creative thinking can play in problem solving as it relates to some of our social issues.
There's I'm trying to remember actually where I got this from. I think you might have written it. I don't think it was a quote from an interview. I think it was from something you wrote explaining the project, but let me just read it out for a second. Sorry, it was for the St. Quentin project. It was for Nigel Poor's exhibition. This exhibition seeks to not only invite audiences to discover how images of incarcerated populations have been codified, but also promote more critical skills in reading the cultural signs and power structures inherent within visual images. I want to sort of underscore that last bit. And also, it is exciting to consider how the museum might act as a catalyst in conversations about criminal justice in Wisconsin, which, you know, leads me to, again, I think the point you were just making, the potential role of institutions and curators and artists, obviously, everyone in sort of the ecology of art, to think through the possibilities of being a catalyst in these discussions.
And in particular, how to do it responsibly. I think that's a really important element to it, because a lot of institutions, I think, would seek to attempt a conversation, but might not know what steps they have to take in order to ensure that they're representing populations appropriately and inviting the right people to have a voice, and just making sure that the proper structure is in place for those conversations. And I think that's something that we're all going to be grappling with as we move into this new future.
I mean, I think we all are already, but I mean, I think you guys were sort of significant pioneers in that. How can I ask you how you sort of set up those structures with Amelia? What were the conversations like when you were thinking about how, you know, two female curators at two different institutions in Milwaukee would take this on?
I mean, there were so many.
Yeah, okay. I get you.
I think so much of it at first was trying to determine how to structure it so that it would not just be useful for as an intellectual exercise, but could potentially offer something without taking on something too big that it obviously wouldn't be able to tackle. And so I think the most important thing we did was we formed a task force that was such a broad coalition of people. I mean, we had people from the Department of Justice, we had people from the Department of Corrections, we had lawyers and judges across the community, we had previously incarcerated people from the NAACP. And so as long as we had their buy-in, I think that helped us kind of ensure that we were structuring the symposium in a way that would actually be useful to the populations we were attempting to serve, instead of pitching something at people without really listening to them.
Yeah, no, you know, having been there and you know, been in a number of the workshops, it was sort of really amazing to me how non-theoretical a lot of the discussion was, right? And how pitched towards practice much of it was. I mean, from the guests that you brought, who were actually sort of practicing in the field, they were actually taking art to do work in the field, Nigel being, you know, case in point. I'm actually spacing the name of this wonderful woman who works in New York with young juveniles.
Yeah, there's Sean Leonardo and Rachel.
Rachel Cohen.
Yeah. Right.
And I'm trying to remember, I'll try to remember the name of her organization for those who want to look it up. Anyway, young New Yorkers. Young New Yorkers, a really fantastic group who, among other things, work with the criminal justice system to convince the system, convince prosecutors convince judges to punish young offenders to time making art, which as an alternative, obviously, to juvie or to jail is fantastic. Anyway, I'm cheating here because I think I'm cheating again because I think there's genuinely a model there to consider, both from the point of curatorial work and also from the point of view of institutions. But moving forward with the idea of promoting critical skills in reading photographs, right? Which sort of by definition are the most ubiquitous cultural signs we have. Let's maybe have a look at some of the images that you selected for this conversation from the neighbors. So I think, Don, there you go. That first image of Zora's. Let me give me a minute. So Lisa, let's say 2 or 3 words about Zora. So he's contextualized a bit for folks who haven't seen the show and haven't listened to earlier conversations. So Zora's slideshow of 20 images is up at the museum in the larger East Gallery. I should preface this by saying that we asked the artist to give us somewhere between 20 and 40 images. Those were the perfect numbers so that they actually fit on the carousel. We figured that out later. It's a physical carousel as opposed to a digital carousel. So, sometimes while you fly the plane, you build a plane. That was sort of the way it worked this time around in putting the show together. Zora decided to do a very compact and very powerful set of 20 images. So Zora, who is he? He lives. He's a professor at the University of Arkansas. He lives in Fayetteville, Arkansas. He's among the country's most distinguished voices in photography, dealing with what is obviously an insanely cussed intersection of race and society in America. And he just won Aperture's Next Step Award, which is insanely well-deserved, and has a new book coming out and a show in New York, which I'll be able to enjoy in about a year. Interestingly, sort of a mini sidebar, Zora's, and I say this because of the earlier conversation about the San Quentin project and the Milwaukee model, Zora's use of photography, according to himself, was in part kickstarted by his experience working with incarcerated youth. Lastly, I'll mention that he has titled the slideshow "Exceptionalism as a Belief System for Erasing Oneself."
It's a great title.
It is a great title, right? And that exceptionalism has multiple readings. I mean, there's American exceptionalism, but there's, also as he puts it, the idea of exceptionalism as a belief system for erasing oneself. Somebody else's exceptionalism erasing your sense of self. So why did you pick this image? What struck you about this image? Which, by the way, is the first one in the slideshow.
I think there's something very ambiguous about this image. I mean, there's a sense of mistake to it because of the way it's cut off at the bottom, which is probably the sort of first part of the reel of the photographic of the film back when people used film instead of digital. And there's also kind of a sense of both. You can't really tell if he's defending himself. Is he catching a baseball? He's in this kind of stance that in some ways you might interpret as both offensive and defensive. And I think in my reading, he's catching a baseball. But I think you also might read it as, if you weren't looking carefully, I think it sort of makes you question how you read images of African-American men in this country. And so I find it to be a really interesting photograph for so many ways because it asks you to question your perceptions. And it's also just a really lovely composition, beautiful colors.
I'm reminded of at least an NYPD use of the word flexing to describe an athletic or potentially offensive stance on the part of a potential arrestee. This gentleman is flexing. And you're right. If you're not looking at the fact that he's got a glove on, a baseball glove on, yeah, he's in an athletic stance.
Mhm.
You're not sure if it's defensive or it's offensive, or if it's not neither of the two. If he's playing, if it's now, Zora also has this interesting habit of appropriating is the wrong word, but revivifying images from elsewhere. So this, I believe, is not a picture he took. I'm not 100% certain. But I love the idea of his ability to take images and then and introduce them, particularly in these sequences, and make them his own, make them part of his own story. I think it's really powerful.
I think too, the way he structured his sequence, and for those of you who are listening, you should sort of look through the pictures, because I think especially for photographers, sequence is so much a part of the way they want you to experience the pictures. And one picture can have one meaning, but then when you see the way that their meanings might evolve once you see them in a specific order and have a dialogue amongst them, that does change what the pictures mean. And so I think Zora really put together this very sensitive and thoughtful and conceptual sequence in which there are repetitive photographs and pictures of construction, found photographs, pictures he took. And I think it's really a beautiful set of images.
I think so too, and tight. Don, let's go to the next image.
Yeah.
Speaking of repeating images, right?
Yeah, so this is an image that repeats throughout the sequence. And it's one of my favorites. I'm so glad we're looking at it tonight, because I think, to me, this photograph speaks to the practice of democracy, the fact that it isn't sort of ongoing process, that it's something we must practice daily, that it has to be something we all engage in every day for it to function. And so there's this sense of his peering through a dense brush to look at this American flag on what appears to be a kind of historic American porch. And that sense of wanting to reach that point, but perhaps not being there, but constantly striving for it. And also perhaps a sense of those who are being left out of that conversation. So I think the fact that this picture continually repeats itself is one that kind of creates both a sort of almost a musical pattern throughout the set of pictures, but also just continually reminds us. And I think I sort of selected a number of pictures that had American flags in part because I was thinking about the way Robert Frank used
brilliant,
the American flag throughout this beautiful and seminal book, The Americans, as a symbol of something that means many things to many people.
I'm so glad you did that, and I'm so glad you had the presence of mind to bring the Americans and like pull it out. That's fantastic. Yeah, look, it does seem to. I mean, clearly someone is looking at this piece of cloth that is supposed to be a symbol of unity, right? From the outside in. They're not quite belonging. I mean, that's one reading. But it does, to the degree that this is a symbol of unity, it does seem to be the kind of symbol, whose potential remains kind of unfulfilled, from the POV of looking at this flag on the porch, and the fact that it appears as a coda 3 or 4 times in the sequence is really powerful. Shall we go to the next set of images?
Yeah, I love this picture. So Katia Maria Landeros, her entire set of photographs are portraits of people set in these gardens, these interstitial spaces where the rural meets the suburban, the wild meets the rural. And the thing I love about this picture is, you know, here's this girl, she's sort of presenting this snake wrapped around her arm. And it just reminds me so much of a figurine of a goddess or a priestess. And I think of her as inviting us into this garden that she's created in her pictures.
Let me just say a couple of words about Katia too, just so everyone gets a little background on her. She's a Mexican-American photographer, an educator, a Guggenheim Fellow. She, I think, currently is teaching at Wellesley College. Though during the past decade or more, her work has focused overwhelmingly on Latinx communities and the exploration of their history, their migration, their representation, their belonging. She's been working, I think, mostly in Northern California. I think Vallejo is where she has long been based. I think she grew up there. But predominantly Hispanic agricultural towns in Oregon and Washington State. That's where these pictures are taken. Some years ago, Katia spent 2 years living in Mexico while documenting communities with the highest rates of historic northward migration. That is to say, communities that were transformed on both sides of the border by a century of continuous migration between Mexico and the US. Having gotten that out of the way, yeah, I had the same reading of this image. It actually it throws me back onto art history of the sort of like painting variety, of the Jansen's art history textbook variety. And you know, paintings of, you know, even the garden or Cleopatra, you know, French academic pictures, yeah. Or pictures of Lilith. And, you know, also I don't know if you're scared of snakes for some bizarre reason. I am. So some recoil on my part. Shall we go to the next image? We're back to the flags.
Yeah. So I liked how they showed up in everyone's series of pictures, whether they meant to or not, or whether they were sort of there in the background. But in so many of Katia's pictures, there are these fences, these kind of spaces that are divided either by a kind of agricultural fence or by these white picket fences. And here this one is tending this extremely fertile and well sort of colorful, vibrant garden. And the flag is kind of blurry in the background, but it's almost a kind of idyll of what American life might be. You get the sort of American dream here.
You do. It's not just the garden and the flag, it's the white picket fence, mm-hmm. Right? And as I was looking at this and I was thinking about Zora's picture of the flag, you know, it occurred to me that I think her name is Fulgencia, and we know that from the title, the subject, right? That she seems to be significantly more comfortable in its shadow, you know. You know, I'm projecting big time here, but I'm thinking of the way certain presidential vote has just been split, and how, you know, the Latino community, which is in no way monolithic, identifies partly or part of that community um, better, I suppose, with that kind of symbology.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially thinking about the political environment we're in, how I think the right has kind of taken on the flag as the symbol of their identity. And it's important to remember that it's actually a symbol for all of us. And so I really like how the flag weaves its way through these pictures, even if it's sort of critical or asking questions. It's really a sort of a sense of who is the flag for and
Right.
what does it mean to people? And so it does get to that question you're asking is, what does America look like? And how do we identify ourselves, and who has a right to identify themselves as an American, and what does that mean?
And I also like that in the set of images that you selected, we're finding these rhymes, these really important rhymes, right? To think through, you know, in the way that we think about not just these pictures, but pictures in general, you know,
Mm-hmm.
their interrelations. I was, and I mentioned this back in the green room some minutes ago, that somebody mentioned to me what it was like to walk through the exhibition, The Neighbors, a few hours ago, and they made a set of connections that I clearly had forgotten, you know, are easily made when you're in a space and you're seeing Katya's work in some proximity to Zora's, in some proximity to Midland's. They play off each other, not only within their own sort of their own sequences, the slideshows, but they play off each other when they're basically hung, as it were, projected in proximity to each other in the same space. Let's move to Guy Greenberg's images. Let me just say 2 words about Guy. Guy Greenberg is based in New York City. He spends a lot of time photographing the city communities of Williamsburg and Crown Heights, Brooklyn, through an alternating series of street photography and portraits. He basically works to contrast their these communities are particularly resistant to assimilation and change, which makes for a really interesting contrast with, I think, the rest of the images that we're looking at. I think in many ways, the communities that Guy has devoted himself to photographing over the last 5 or 6 years seem to sort of want the opposite of, say, Katya's subjects. They really are not about assimilation. They're about something else. They're about strict religious adherence, an embrace of a certain kind of traditional patriarchy, and a repudiation of modern culture. And in a certain sense, as bizarre as it sounds, since they are based largely in New York City, frankly, a block away from me, what they're after is a certain kind of bubble-like separation from the modern world. Having said that, I think, you know, Guy's images, at least for me, are these sort of, you know, strange contemporary echoes of like the social photography of like the late 19th century and early 20th century, and
Yeah.
folks like Louis Hine and Jacob
Okay.
Riis. But you tell me, why did you select this image?
Well, I think, well, first of all, I've been thinking a lot about, you know, I'm working with Susan Meiselas, who did a series of pictures called the Prince Street Girls, where she photographed the girls in her neighborhood of Little Italy, essentially, in New York, beginning in the 1970s. And, you know, even looking at those pictures, I think back to Helen Levitt photographing the children on the streets of New York, and how there were these insular neighborhoods at that time, but they've sort of dissipated. And I think of this as this one place where there are still these insular neighborhoods, which is what New York used to be much more like. And yet at the same time, these kids could be any kids anywhere, because boys love to play these games. And it's so that you get this sense of both of these things happening at the same time, that they're both insular and connected to this larger zeitgeist almost, or cultural interest in playing cops and robbers or whatever it is they're playing. And then also thinking again about a lot of the pictures we've been seeing this year about the police and about who is safe around the police, and how these children are sort of acting out a lot of the pictures they've probably seen in the media and, you know, on their own streets.
I mean, you know, they've got a playground, even if it's literally sort of like the corner lot,
Mhm.
you know, and in the shadow of this police cruiser that's essentially there to make sure there is no anti-Semitic violence, because
Mhm.
that is a threat to this community,
Mhm.
which is real. But in the shadow of that, they're still playing, which is remarkable. Let's go to the next image.
Yeah, and this one gets to what you were saying about this sense of being in a bubble. There's this, you know, two women really just kind of putting their heads together and surrounded by a sea of black pants and black shoes, just this absolute homogeneity almost. And there they are, but they have community together. And so I don't know, there's something about that I found really compelling, but also it's like Zora's picture in that you feel both a part, you feel like an observer more than you are invited to be a part of the community in this picture.
You mean the flag picture of Zora's?
The flag
Yeah,
picture.
no, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's exactly sort of like the place to connect. They're, you know, on the outside looking in. The legs they're looking through are all boys and men, and they're not allowed on those that set of bleachers. Whatever is going on the other side of the bleachers, whether it's a Rebbe speaking or it's some celebration, or it's some kind of march, there are men on the other side, and they as women can only occupy literally sort of the back end of this. So it's a remarkable picture. But it does give you a sense of, you know, not just them and us, but like I said, outside looking in, you know.
There's a distance in observation.
Right. Let's have a look at Woodland's images. And let me just say 2 words about Woodland. Woodland Cadet is a Haitian-born artist based in Syracuse, New York. She has actually been publishing a lot in the New Yorker. She had an image published. She had a photograph published of Joe Biden, I think about 3 weeks ago, a month ago, which is terrific. If you, I mean, anyone who's watching, you should look it up. And I think she had an image in a story about 2 weeks ago about an article about BLM. I actually don't remember the title of it or who wrote it now, but anyway, she's been very active. But her photographs draw from personal history, and they tend to want to examine race, memory. These are her words in terms of describing her project: erasure, migration, immigration, and Haitian cultural identity as an immigrant that is from within the United States. According to her, again, she uses photography, video, and installations to construct a visual language that explores notions of visibility and hypervisibility, Black feminine interiority, and selfhood. I should also say that the photos in her particular slideshow, which she titled the Every Other Good Thing series, were taken with a Fujifilm disposable camera. So why this image?
Well, I think I chose this one in particular in response to the picture that I chose by Katya, thinking about how the garden is this kind of motif for American success, both that and sort of the Garden of Eden also. But, you know, I was so struck by the idea that, you know, as a Haitian immigrant and as someone who coming to the United States and becoming an American citizen, and thinking about what you lose when you change your identity or evolve your identity. Not just what you gain, but what you might lose or what might morph. And the fact that she didn't have a set of family snapshots to look at. And so wanting to create that for her own family and for future generations, and really thinking about what you would take pictures of if that's what you were trying to do. And I found her choices so interesting, because there's a picture like this, which really is almost a kind of monument to that American dream. And then there are also so many pictures that are just much more everyday, ordinary, but also kind of documenting and recording the vibrancy of life around the edges. And even the way she composed this, that you're sort of in the garden. You're not looking at the garden, you're in it. And so I found that really interesting.
I love the way, I mean, it just occurred to me that clearly you made a slideshow out of 5 slideshows, and the threads that are basically running through them all. You know, the garden is again come up. Obviously, the flags came up. I don't think we get to see another snake in the garden, but there's that as well. Yeah, I mean, this to me looks like a picture of stability. This, I don't know why it makes me almost think of something so Eastern Seaboardy, summer Eastern Seaboardy, you know, Maine or Nantucket, or, you know, something that, you know, one wouldn't commonly think is sort of part of the Haitian immigrant experience. Yet, you know, these, I'm not quite sure what to call them, but they you know, they look like Greek columns, but they're, you know, steadfast, and they're implanted almost like flags in the middle of this obviously well-tended garden.
Yeah, there are roots taking hold here.
And that's really well put. And frankly, your point about her constructing really sort of out of nothing with, you know, a disposable Fujifilm camera, a lore, essentially, a set of family pictures that didn't exist. Because what happens when you emigrate is that you basically leave a lot of shit behind. You can't take everything with you, you know. Maybe, you know, and maybe it's not only that you couldn't take, you know, your scrapbooks, maybe you didn't have it.
Yeah. And I think that's true for a lot of communities. I mean, there are so many photographers who are interested in creating a visual narrative and a visual history of communities that have just been absent, because either there was no money to take pictures, or there just isn't a historical record of certain places because they didn't appear to be deserving of that at the time. And so
Right.
I think there's a lot of interest in that now.
Right. Let's go to the next image. Thank you.
And this is one where the flag creeps back in, but again, it's just the idea of taking this picture and taking it from this angle. If you're creating a kind of record of your family, and thinking about the use of the mirror to reflect the room, but also all of that kind of stuff of life, the Delta frequent flyer card in the corner, and the birthday cards, and the American flag, and, you know, candle, but just kind of really reflecting a brilliant and joyful life being lived in this space. And then what you see reflected in the mirror is that life.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, they seem tremendously comfortable, easeful, you know. They seem like the kind of family that, you know, that's the kind of life that, like, people want to aspire to. Let's move on. Let's look at a couple of images from Curran Heidelberg. Now, Curran, just to say 2 words about him, is an American photographer. He's based in Baltimore, Maryland. He's clearly a guy for folks who will take the time to look through the entire slideshow, because there, as I mentioned before, individualized slideshows on the website. I hope you do, please do. He is someone who's very much influenced by the American tradition of road photography. Lisa mentioned Robert Frank before, and his process basically entails driving around the US and interacting with various strangers and whatever the locales they live in. He told me that some interactions with these strangers last 30 minutes, others 30 days. That's his line, which I find quite beautiful, actually. And his photos are basically traces of these encounters. There was I first saw his work at the Whitney Biennial in 2019, and he got the 3rd floor of the museum, and I wasn't just impressed by the pictures, but later I actually saw some of his images on the website for the biennial, and there was a recording of him speaking in an interview, and there was a line that he uttered, which really sort of got me, and it got me thinking, among other things, not just about his images and images in general, photographs in general, but frankly also kind of led me to think about putting the show together. And his line is, "It's only through others that we'll understand ourselves, our country, and our current moment." That seems to me to encapsulate a good part of this project. He goes out there and, he takes significant care to see through others' eyes. Anyway, this image, again, the flag, in a particularly sort of, I don't know, can you be blinded by the flag?
Yeah. I mean, this picture encapsulates all of the things we've been talking about. It's someone's yard, it's a flag, it's their garden, it's the wilderness meets the domestic. But he's standing on this flimsy chair, and his head is just kind of draped with the flag. It's almost as if he's been kind of bewildered, or kind of the flag has come alive and eaten his head. And I think it's such a perfect metaphor in so many ways for so much of what's been going on, but it's also a beautiful picture.
Yeah, it really is. And the corn behind him makes this American somehow,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and then the flagpole becomes a kind of cross. So there's this sense of like, what's being taken down from the cross, and who is he? And yeah, I do see a metaphor in the way that flag has sort of befuddled the man. Like, what is this myth that we believe in?
And does it actually sort of allow us to see, or does it sometimes actually literally blind us?
Mm-hmm.
Let's go to the next image.
And this is such a perfect metaphor for all of us now, waiting. This is a picture that is just about anticipation, but also about sort of a drive. I mean, clearly he's thrown something in the air, but the way his body is just kind of anticipating its return. It's also sort of the perfect juxtaposition to the first image we looked at of the man catching the baseball. So two different figures really waiting for something to reach them.
I can't thank you enough for putting this together, because you really made an astoundingly coherent slideshow from 5 slideshows. You're absolutely right. The rhyme back is perfect. And yeah, it is sort of through the windshield moment. That's not the right phrase here, but yeah, he's expectant. He's waiting for whatever is going to come. He's playing, but unfortunately for us, it could be an anvil as well as a baseball.
He definitely feels more joy than we feel.
I think he's far more joyful. Well, that's fantastic, and what a wonderful read of the show. Again, I really can't thank you enough. But let's talk briefly about your show, about the show that you're going to open soon, of Susan Meiselas. As I've been a big admirer of her work for some time. Particularly I've got well, not a soft spot, but I have some history with Nicaragua in the period that she photographed, in the late 70s, early 80s, there. But in any event, what a tremendous photographer. And I think the reading that you're giving it is also insanely timely. So maybe you can walk us through the images you've got.
Sure.
And tell us a little about the show.
Yeah, so I mean, Susan is an artist I've always not only admired, but kind of looked to in terms of the ethics of seeing and understanding what it means to interrogate the documentary process. And so it's not just, I don't think of her just as someone who makes pictures, but she's sort of a mentor. She's someone who asks the questions that lead us to understand what documentary photography means. And I've always been interested too in her role in feminist practice. And so given that it's the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, we thought we would take a look at this sort of feminist lens on her work. And in doing so, we sort of dug through some of her archives. And if you go to the next slide, we discovered a number of photographs that people had never seen before, or that had maybe been published somewhere, but probably hadn't been seen widely. And so I think, we've, as Christian mentioned, the exhibition is installed, will open virtually. And that means we've created a sort of 360-degree virtual tour that has multiple layers of content. So I've been doing a lot of interviews with Susan, and we've done interviews with her collaborators, with the participants, the subjects of her photographs, and there's historical sort of interviews as well. So we've been thinking a lot about how she was interested in the roles assigned to women, but in particular, how she found herself looking at women who were kind of trying to break out of those roles. And so here's a picture on the left of a group of sorority girls at Madison in the 1970s, performing this ritual of getting themselves ready, I would assume, for a party. And thinking about Susan as someone to whom that ritual seems somewhat foreign, kind of ethnographically examining it. And then on the right, a photograph from a Miss Nude USA competition in Atlantic City in the 1970s. She was probably only there for a day. She didn't get to know the people like she might have in another project, but you see them kind of using the mirror in the same way. And yet the ritual is a bit different here. And these are the women who are perhaps in some ways trying to break out, and in other ways trying to break into a different kind of acceptance, I guess. Next slide.
It's remarkable in both cases, though, since these are back rooms.
Yeah.
Before the performance, how she seems to sort of like almost not be there, like that, that no one notices her presence.
Right, and she's able to do that as a woman. I mean, I think women are preparing themselves for men, and she is watching them do it in a way, kind of assessing what that means. And then another picture from the Miss Nude competition. And then on the right, a picture from the 1980s of a very different kind of competition of women bodybuilders. And the sense of when women are competing and what it is they're sort of doing with their bodies. But I love the picture on the left with this man in the foreground who's got this cigarette dangling from his mustached face, and he sort of represents to me something about the patriarchy. I just love that picture. So next slide. And then there's also a sense of Susan as an artist in the 1970s who was kind of defining a generation. So on the left, a picture from Prince Street Girls of these young women who were her neighbors, really. And she followed them on the subway out to the beach at Coney Island. And there they are, kind of enjoying the day, listening to the radio, but this sense of the joy of youth before they really have to deal with what becoming a woman really is. And then on the right, Susan was one of her first assignments really photographing the women delegates at the DNC in New York in 1976, which is when she met Gilles Perez, and that sort of chance meeting is what happens to end up with her entering the Magnum collective at the time. But this sense of the importance of women and the women's movement in the 1970s, and how perhaps that has shifted or not today. I mean, think about who's in politics now. So next slide.
Let me ask you, most were the bodies of work that we've just sort of seen examples of, were these done on assignment or not, or mixed bag?
So that's an excellent question. So for the most part, Susan sort of followed her own intuition. And so she sort of looked for these stories of women. And so the Miss Nude competition, the bodybuilders, the Prince Street Girls are all just projects she was working on her own. The DNC, she was commissioned to go, and she was assigned to make those pictures. But there is this sort of interesting conversation we have about what the media would have been interested in at the time, and what she did anyway, because she wanted people to see those pictures. And yet they still, to this day, to the most part, haven't seen them. So it's kind of interesting to think about what having a woman in this field that is largely, up to that point, white and male, does when she can bring her perspective to who needs to be photographed. And then here, Susan's probably one of her more well-known series, Carnival Strippers. Again, thinking about the women's movement in the 1970s and how at that moment, the feminists really looked down on women who stripped for money. And Susan was more interested in what might motivate them, and why was, this is an opportunity that was available to them, and it was how they were able to make money. I mean, so here's a portrait of Lena on her first day. And then again 3 years later, and on her first day, she joined the girl show so that she could make some money, because her husband had taken the wheels off her car and kind of locked her in the house, and she wanted to divorce him. So thinking about what was available to women like this, and how they could make opportunities for themselves. And so, Susan is someone for whom collaboration is a really important part of her process. And so Lena became an important part of this project. Her voice is sort of predominant, I would say. Next slide.
Amazing.
And the same is true if we think about what the girls' show meant, that Susan isn't thinking about it from perhaps the perspective of a visitor, but instead she's thinking about what it was like for the women. So this photograph of Shorty on the left, relaxing backstage, I think of it almost as an odalisque. You can almost imagine Manet painting this, but Shorty's not presenting herself to Susan. She's sort of turned off, and she's probably anticipating what will come next. This is very hard work. And then on the right is also Shorty, but instead here she's sort of transformed into this idealized version of the magic of the female form, to which the boys are all kind of looking up, taken from a very low perspective, this kind of blurred moving figure, almost as if she's a mirage. Next slide. And a series of pictures of women in the US Army that, again, Susan made and haven't been seen, but what's fascinating about them is that they were training both for things like the exercise with gas masks, and also how to put on makeup, which I'm sure that the men in the military were not getting trained on at that time.
I look forward to the moment when they actually are.
I know. Next slide. and thinking about how women in the U.S. Army were not allowed on the front lines. But when Susan went to Nicaragua in the late 1970s to cover the insurrection, women were both guerrilla fighters like Marta on the left, who were kind of forced into, not forced into, but perhaps chose to be real protagonists in what was happening there. And then also on the right, women waiting at a prison to find out if their loved ones have been disappeared, will they be returned? And these are the kinds of pictures that, because Susan was there on her own, really, not on assignment, and stayed, didn't just fly in to cover these moments of conflict, but stayed to understand what it looked like, what the consequences were for people, and in particular for women. You get this very interesting perspective of what happened in Nicaragua and how Susan might have been implicated as an American. But I think in part, the exhibition for me is a chance to consider how collaboration is a feminist practice, but also how this early sort of feminist grounding sort of shaped who she would become as a more international kind of geopolitical photojournalist. So I hope you'll sort of check out the virtual exhibition when we launch it on the Milwaukee Art Museum webpage, and perhaps join us for some of our virtual programs also.
Well, I definitely will. I mean, I can't wait to see it. Like I said, that I've got some family in Nicaragua, and I've got an aunt who actually, I mean, I don't know how well she knows Susan, but they probably connected since he's been there since the revolution started. What was the revolution? Yeah, I'm very keen on seeing, well, the entire show, the way you just described, her seeing through, a woman's lens. Dave Waterman, do we have any questions?
Hi, yes, we do. We have a question.
Terrific.
Currently here. This is someone who's would like to know a little bit about the technical aspect of the Neighbors slideshow. She says it sounded like they're actual slide projectors. So were these digital images made into actual 35mm transparencies?
Not in every case, because we had Fuji Woodland Cadet basically used a throwaway camera to make the pictures first, and then we transferred those into slides. A number of the other images, yeah, they were essentially digital images, or we received them as digital images, and then we had to transfer them into slides, and then insert them into our sourced oldie timey carousels. Weird exercise, but one that I was encouraged to pursue by a couple of the artists in the show. Part of what we really wanted to do is to get that sound happening, that would suggest something more than the pictures, as insanely elusive as they all are. We really did want to sort of cast back to vacation pictures time, around the hearth, or so in any event, that was the idea there. Do we have any other questions?
Your answer covered the other question, which just popped up, which involved the sound of the slide projectors and its nostalgia, and was that intentional? And here's another one that's just popped up, haven't read yet. Okay. I'm interested in hearing about an experience with a photograph that has transformed their way of thinking about photographic language. Was it a vernacular image?
You want to read that again?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, that was the first time read out there. I'm interested in hearing about an experience with a photograph that transformed their way of thinking about photographic language. Was it a vernacular image? And I presume it's asking the the two of you to speak about photography. An experience with a photograph that transformed their way of thinking about photographic language.
Fine. You're not talking about the artist, me, you, Lisa as well.
Yeah.
A way, Lisa, in which a photograph transformed your way of thinking about photographic language. Was it a vernacular image, meaning, was it something meant to be hung inside a museum, or was it something that you saw?
I mean, there's probably a lot of different examples of that, but I think one that I would speak to, which I think speaks to this show, Christian, is Larry Sultan and Mike Mandel's Evidence, which was a series of pictures that they gathered from governmental, educational, police, NASA archives throughout California in the 1970s, and took out of context and then created a narrative through sequence with the pictures. And I think something about spending a lot of time with those images also related to me to the San Quentin archive, which could have been a part of Evidence, but thinking about how the meaning of an image changes depending on its context. And I think that's so much of what we talked about tonight in terms of both how the artists sequenced the pictures they presented for you, and then how even me taking them out of that context and putting them together changes how you read them as well. So I think there's something about the context within which photographs sit that for me is really important in terms of how you translate the pictorial language.
Yeah, you mentioned the ethics of seeing before. I mean, I think that's part of reading the image in context is a function of that, right? I'm not quite sure how I'd answer the question. I'll say this. Just in terms of what informs this show, I did see a terrific set of images by a guy named Gary Winogrand at the Brooklyn Museum about a year ago. And they were essentially presented as a slideshow, almost as a walk-in slideshow. The images were projected significantly larger than we've got them. And it was a show of I think previously unseen images by Winogrand, who actually did most of his work or published most of his work in black and white. And so these were not only vibrant and spectacular, but the experience of actually seeing them sequenced into a slideshow was important to me, and clearly, was an inspiration for the neighbors. We got anything else, Dave?
There's nothing at the moment.
Okay, well,
I have Margaret Miller.
What's that?
I have Margaret Miller.
Oh, you have Margaret Miller. I've got one quick question here. I think somebody just handed this to me. Oh yeah, somebody couldn't couldn't figure out how to log in to the question on Zoom, and she wanted to know, Lisa, had you visited the PS1, the MoMA PS1, Making Time in the Age of Mass Incarceration, right? Okay, which is, I believe, up now. So I don't think you have.
Well, no, because I'm not able to come to New York, unfortunately, because of COVID, but I will tell you that I have the catalog. I was just seeing if I could find it, because the catalog's phenomenal, and Nicole Fleetwood's research is fantastic. I mean, it's a major exhibition, and it's a shame that many of us won't get to see it because of COVID, but I'm sure there will be great programs online, and the catalog's phenomenal. So definitely pick that up if it's
do pick it up. I saw the show. It's fabulous. Listen, it's up to me now to shut this down. But before that, I got to say, listen, Lisa, thank you so much for being here. It was fantastic. A really wonderful reading on the show, and I'm really, really grateful.
Thank you, Christian. This was fun.
Yeah.
Well, then I will just add my thank you to both of you. I think that we have a new view of the exhibition through your kind of recurating a slideshow for us. And indeed, it was not only the works in the exhibition, but your conversation between you and Christian was a catalyst for thinking about how we observe and how we look at the world. And I'm very grateful to you for participating. And I look forward to following your work and the exhibitions that you put together. And maybe we can even do an exchange of shows at some point with the Milwaukee Art Museum. And I hope also that you will be able to come to Tampa at some point and see what we're doing down here. So thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you, Christian, for participating. I believe this conversation will be posted. So if you all came in late, I saw some people coming in a little bit late, the conversation will be available for everybody to review. So thanks to all who watched and participated and asked questions, and thank you both for contributing to a very rich discussion. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thanks so much. Bye. Bye, Lisa.
Bye.